Good evening and welcome to the 11th annual Leon Levy Biography Lecture. My name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director for the last year and a half or so. As you know, this lecture was established in 2007 by Shelby White, who is here in the audience this evening, in the memory of her late husband, who was an avid reader of biographies. But in fact, I believe it was Shelby's good friend Nancy Milford, the biographer of Zelda, who convinced Leon that the Academy was ignoring hard-working biographers. Since then, since 2007, the Leon Levy Center has awarded more than 44 substantial fellowships to support working biographers on their projects. Many of them are in the audience tonight, the 4 new fellows also. Nearly 20 biographies have been published, and numerous PhD candidates have also been encouraged to explore the wonders of biography. All of this has been an extraordinary gift to the world of biography. No other university anywhere is doing this work. And as a result, I would argue that the City University of New York has become quite literally a Trojan horse for advancing the cause of scholarly biography within the Academy. That's a large claim, but it's true. As such, this has been a very successful but decidedly subversive project. Biographers everywhere are deeply grateful for Shelby White's steadfast support. Thank you, Shelby. These lectures now, going on 11 years, have become a highly prestigious award. Indeed, the lecture now comes with a $10,000 stipend, exactly on par, I should point out, with the Pulitzer Prize. Past recipients have included Robert Caro, who is with us tonight, Ron Chernow, Richard Holmes, Brenda Wineapple, Hermione Lee, David Levering Lewis, Stacy Schiff, Hilary Sperling, and Robert Massey. Tonight, I am pleased to introduce Geoffrey C. Ward as our 2018 Leon Levy speaker. An historian, biographer, and screenwriter, Geoffrey Ward is the author of 16 books, including A First-Class Temperament, The Emergence of Franklin Roosevelt, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Francis Parkman Prize, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He has written or co-written many documentary films, including The War, The Civil War, Baseball, The West, Mark Twain, Not Ourselves Alone, Jazz, The Roosevelts, The Kennedys, and most recently, the Vietnam War, the highly acclaimed multi-part TV series broadcast on PBS last year. More than most biographers, Geoff Ward has demonstrated a keen sensibility and talent for dealing with a very wide range of topics. He can write about presidents, but I suppose because he spent his boyhood in India, he has also written not one, but 2 books about tigers, one with the delightful title, Tiger Wallahs, Encounters with the Men Who Tried to Save the Greatest of the Cats. Indeed, he has a talent for book titles as well. Book titles are very hard. You struggle always to get a good book title. Anyway, 6 years ago, he published a book about his great-grandfather, Ferdinand Ward, and called it, this is lovely, A Disposition to be Rich: How a Small-Town Pastor's Son Ruined an American President, Brought on a Wall Street Crash, and Made Himself the Best-Hated Man in the United States. Geoff will speak tonight on the biographer's dilemma, searching for the known and the unknowable. Geoffrey Ward.
It's a great honor, and I'm very grateful. Before I begin, I'd like to express some more gratitude to the person who got me started in the biography business, my late Aunt Mary. I didn't know her very well. She was an unmarried librarian, lived in Boston, and rarely attended our family holidays held halfway across the country. But I will always be grateful to her for two things. When I had reached an embarrassingly advanced age, she taught me how to tie my shoes. I have written here that I was 7. I think I was actually either 8 or 9, but my wife told me if I said that, she would leave me, so I'm risking a lot this evening. And starting on my 10th birthday, and at every birthday and every Christmas thereafter, she sent me the latest volumes in the Landmark series of history books for children. There were eventually almost 200 of them. Most were admiring biographies. Their subjects were what you would have expected in those days: soldiers, statesmen, gunfighters, inventors, explorers. There were just 15 female subjects, only 7 Native Americans, all but 2 of them war chiefs, and just 1 African American, the ingenious but suitably non-controversial George Washington Carver. But the stories were beautifully told by the best writers their publisher, Bennett Cerf, could find: Pearl Buck, Dorothy Canfield Fisher, C.S. Forrester, Shirley Jackson, Robert Penn Warren. Aunt Mary could never quite keep track of how old I was getting to be, and continued to send me landmarks until I was well into my senior year in college. But as a kid, I devoured each volume, couldn't wait for the next one, and have often wondered how many other biographers of my generation were first inspired by those lively books. In any case, I thought I'd talk this evening about the pleasures and frustrations of writing about my very first subject, Franklin Roosevelt, and my last, my own great-grandfather, the swindler you've heard about, Ferdinand Ward. Each harbored his own hoard of closely guarded secrets. I set out to uncover as many as I could. I think I deciphered some. I know I failed to uncover a lot more. The fun is in the chase. For me, that's the special pleasure of writing biography. No recreated life is ever definitive. There's always more to say. My involvement with FDR began with a phone call in 1981. I was then the editor of American Heritage magazine. The caller was Professor Robert Butow, a diplomatic historian at the University of Washington. He was awfully sorry to bother me, he said, but he wondered if I might possibly be interested in a little discovery of his. In the autumn of 1940, Franklin Roosevelt had secretly recorded a number of private conversations in the Oval Office. By any chance, would I like to see the transcripts of those recordings? And oh, by the way, the recordings themselves still existed, should I manage to find the time in my busy schedule to listen to them. The discovery of the Nixon tapes was then a relatively recent memory. American Heritage didn't get a lot of scoops. A friend on the staff liked to call it the magazine of dead people. I swore Professor Butow to secrecy and asked him to send me everything he had. The tapes arrived, and I was hooked. Despite the static and crackle of 40 years of disintegration, FDR's extraordinary personality remained undimmed. There he sits, unable to rise from his chair without help, locked in political combat with Wendell Willkie, the most formidable opponent ever sent against him, facing the worst war in history, and he couldn't be having a better time. Nothing phases him. He is amused and amusing, apparently unafraid of anything, somehow serene in the conviction that whatever happens, everything will turn out fine, provided he's in charge. For our recent PBS series on Vietnam, and for a forthcoming series on Lyndon Johnson, I've listened now to other recordings made in the Oval Office. All presidents are not amusing, unafraid, or serenely self-assured. Roosevelt seems always to be on, the same magnetic performer when admiring his secretary's new dress as when parrying questions from an office full of newspaper men. I was reminded as I listened to him of what he is said to have told Orson Welles one evening at the White House. "There are two great actors in the United States, Mr. Welles. You are the other one." I wanted to know how on earth someone got that way. Eleanor Roosevelt's judgment that her husband had had no genuine intimates, that those closest to him, including herself, had merely served his purposes, was harsh but not wholly inaccurate. Roosevelt lived his life in compartments, reveled in misleading enemies and allies alike. But surely the fact that he didn't confide in his wife didn't necessarily mean he didn't long to tell at least some of his troubles to someone, but to whom? And I had another more personally motivated question. Roosevelt himself was so gallantly circumspect about what infantile paralysis had done to him that even his wife was evidently fooled. After the disease's initial assault, she wrote, she never again heard him mention it. Even so normally shrewd an observer as Rexford Tugwell could write that FDR was never bothered by polio. Polio bothered the hell out of me. How could it not have bothered him too? Did he never really complain? I hoped someday I might find out. That day came more quickly than I'd planned. Shortly after American Heritage published transcripts of the Roosevelt tapes, I lost my job and found myself suddenly free to pursue the answers to my questions. Unemployment wonderfully concentrates the mind. I suspect there are as many valid ways to chronicle a life as there are men and women worthy of being chronicled. But as I began to write, I found myself following a few self-imposed rules which I've followed ever since. All such strictures are meant to be broken, of course. I've broken some of them myself, but I thought I'd pass them on this evening for whatever they may be worth. I resolved to rely as much as possible on primary sources and chose not to quote other biographers, although my debt to my predecessors would be carefully footnoted and their insights would be apparent on every page. I was trying to tell Roosevelt's story so far as possible as he lived it, not as others looked back on it. There seemed no point in roping in someone else to say something I ought to be able to say perfectly well myself. I would not pretend ever to know what Roosevelt or anyone else was thinking either. That, it seems to me, should be a luxury available only to novelists. I would also never claim to know with any certainty what Roosevelt or anyone else was doing or not doing once the bedroom door closed. I don't know what my own friends may be up to this evening, let alone what people long ago had in mind. Finally, and most importantly, I would stick as close as I could to chronology. Lives unfold in time. We know how things turned out. Our subjects never do. We have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. They didn't either. The late Arthur Schlesinger was both a generous friend and a mentor to me. No one gave me more generous encouragement when I wasn't at all sure I was up to the job of writing about his great subject. In the first volume of his magisterial, The Age of Roosevelt, he recounts FDR's early life only in elegant flashback after his subject has secured the 1932 presidential nomination, and always with an eye to explaining to the reader how he got there. I resolved to do it the other way around, to write of Roosevelt as if neither I, nor he, nor the reader knew what he was to become. Common sense suggested that the answers to the riddle of Roosevelt's personality, its boldness and caution, its charm and deviousness and underlying confidence, would be found during the relatively unguarded years before he disappeared behind his presidential Cheshire cat grin. I'm going to try this stool. Forgive me just for a sec. see how that works. Whoop, not well. We'll start that again. Get up. Sorry. Friends warned that there might not be enough new material to sustain a fresh, full-scale history of those early years. And even I secretly worried that the end result might be a very slim, very speculative book. Instead, I found enough material for not one, but two sizable volumes that took FDR only as far as his decision to return to politics after his illness. When I began to write, psychobiography was in bad odor, partly because of the grandiose claims made for it by its least supple practitioners, partly because of the evident terror the merest whiff of psychological speculation struck in the hearts of some traditional historians. At its worst, psychobiography was everything its enemies said it was: reductive, jargon-ridden, pseudoscientific. But no life, it seems to me, can be understood unless its chronicler is willing to explore the world of family, the power of parents and siblings and surroundings to shape personality and influence actions. There really shouldn't be anything startling about this. We do the same thing in our everyday lives without a second thought. Who doesn't remember the sudden gleam of understanding experienced at a high school graduation or college commencement when the parents of some until then inexplicable classmate turned up to make everything about their offspring seem instantly self-evident? In thinking back to my earliest days, Roosevelt remembered at the dedication of his presidential library at Springwood, his family estate at Hyde Park, I am impressed by the peacefulness and regularity of things, both in respect to places and people. Up to the age of 7, Hyde Park was the center of the world. For 8 years, off and on, it was the center of my world, too. It's a wonderfully evocative place. As I made my way each day between the reading room and the grim motel across Route 9, in which visiting scholars stayed in those days, it was easy to imagine the cosseted life young Franklin had led there as a small boy. Standing proudly at the tiller of his sailboat on the Hudson, already in command at 6 or 7, perched on the wine-red seat of the family sleigh that had been a gift from the Tsar of Russia to the Emperor of France, sledding down the steep hill behind the house alongside the son of a tenant farmer whose assignment it was to haul the sled back up again. Everything at Springwood conspired to make him feel unique, favored. The succession of fond governesses and tutors whose demands upon him were never allowed to exceed his ability to meet them. The family tenants who doffed their caps and called him Mr. Franklin as he rode by on his pony. Above all, the love of the father, who especially prized him because he had been born to him so late in life, and the relentless approval of his mother, who was certain from the moment of his birth that her son was destined for great things and made sure he shared that certainty. Surely no American statesman ever had a boyhood better calculated to make him feel that the natural order of things was for him to be the center of attention and in charge. Much of the ambition that drove him as an adult, I came to believe, was simply an effort to replicate what seemed to him to be that natural order in the larger world beyond the Hudson. George Will was right, I think, when he suggested that Franklin Roosevelt's idea of the presidency was himself in it. My fear that I would not find enough unexamined material from Roosevelt's formative years to say anything new about them quickly vanished. From the moment of her only child's birth, Sara Delano Roosevelt was convinced that he was destined for great things. And so she saved the smallest relics of his boyhood, snippets of his baby curls and his first shoes, his favorite toys and books, all his school essays and stuffed birds, every chatty letter he dashed off to her from Groton and Harvard and his honeymoon. And she had transferred intact to her son both her unquestioned confidence in his future greatness and her inability to throw away anything even tangentially related to his steady progress toward that goal. FDR saved everything too, not just his papers, 250 tons of them, or the stamps and books and naval prints with which he filled his idle moments, but personal effects as well, thousands and thousands of them, all his check stubs, the menu for every Harvard class dinner he attended, discarded cigarette holders and pipes whose stems he'd chewed off, a silk hat once owned by a congressional candidate who happened to campaign at his side in 1910, a rusty horseshoe he spotted in the desert sand while picnicking after the wartime Cairo conference, a framed spray of flowers woven entirely of hair from the heads of members of the Roosevelt family, every rubber ball chewed by his little dog Fala, and every set of the long, heavy steel braces without which he was not able to stand unaided for the last 24 years of his life. I have destroyed practically nothing, he remembered, and the result is a mind for which future historians will curse as well as praise me. No biographer can do anything but praise him. The riches of the Roosevelt Library spoiled me for all the biographical subjects I've tackled since. And buried among the Roosevelt family papers were letters and journals that revealed a shadowy, little understood side to life at Springwood that was central, I came to believe, in understanding the sunny mask with which Franklin Roosevelt always faced the world. In November 1890, when Franklin was 8 years old, his father, James Roosevelt, suffered a heart attack. He was just 62 and would live on for 10 more years, but he was never entirely well again. For a full decade, the fact of his frailty and the fear that some sudden event, some inadvertent intrusion, might bring on a second fatal attack. It became the central concern of Sara Delano Roosevelt's life and of her sons as well. Good humor and abhorrence of self-pity were already watchwords of the Delano and Roosevelt clans long before James Roosevelt was stricken. Franklin's mother had been especially proud when her father had praised her son while still an infant for being a very nice child, always bright and happy, not crying, worrying, infractious. Now, those much admired traits became a way of life. Franklin's father was never to worry about anything, his mother insisted. Together, she and Franklin would keep everything that might possibly alarm his father to themselves. Franklin literally held his father's fate in his young hands, or so his mother led him to believe, and as a small boy, he accepted what must have been a heavy responsibility with remarkable resolution. Once, when he was only 9 and traveling with his parents aboard his father's private railroad car, a steel curtain rod fell onto his forehead, cutting a deep gash. Blood bathed his face. His mother was terrified. Franklin insisted that his father not be told. He washed up, then asked for a cap, pulled it low to cover the wound, and spent the rest of the day on the observation platform, waiting for a scab to form before he faced his father again at dinner. James Roosevelt's physicians urged him to take the waters in Europe to ease the strain on his heart, and so Franklin spent 4 summers with his parents at a German spa, joining them each morning in the long, slow-moving line of patients waiting their turn at the fountain. Some who waited with them were not well enough to stand. Friends or servants or family members carried them on pallets or pushed them in wheelchairs. Pallid faces noticed one morning might not be in line the next. Sickness and the vivid possibility of death surrounded Franklin every day, all summer long, 4 summers in a row. Yet he is not known ever to have spoken of the appalling signs he must have seen in Germany. Seems deliberately have set out not to seem to notice what was happening all around him, would not allow himself ever to be seen to be frightened or repelled. He knew that he was never to worry his father, nor was he ever to appear to be worried himself. My time in the Roosevelt archives finally persuaded me that that lesson became second nature to him. And years later, when he held the lives of not just one human being, but those of millions in his hands, he would again keep whatever worries he may have had almost entirely to himself. As you can imagine, by the time I went to work, the number of people who remembered Roosevelt before he reached the White House was rapidly dwindling. I interviewed as many as I could. Two mattered most. At Warm Springs, Georgia, I spent several days with Mary Hudson Veeder, a physiotherapist with whom no biographer had ever spoken before. In 1928, she had taught Roosevelt the slow, tottery imitation of walking that had at last permitted him to return to public life, his legs rigid in his braces, leaning on a cane with one hand and gripping the arm of a sturdy companion with the other. It had been an agonizing process. Roosevelt had fallen again and again. He really didn't have any muscles at all, Veeder told me. Then how had he done it? It's all up here, she said, tapping her head. He just decided to do it. He walked on sheer determination. He was ready. It was time. Had he ever seemed discouraged during that struggle, I asked, hoping, a little selfishly, I think, to hear that he sometimes had. Never, she answered. Even among his fellow polios in Warm Springs. He was invariably cheerful, encouraging, circumspect about his own feelings. No one was more often with FDR during the war years than Margaret Lynch Suckley, the quiet, good-humored, distant cousin Roosevelt called Daisy. There are pictures of her riding next to him in his open, hand-controlled car, pouring tea in the First Lady's absence, walking Fala, which had been her gift to him, and finally at the president's side when he was fatally stricken at Warm Springs, Georgia. But to biographers, she remained little more than a name. When I spoke to FDR's last surviving secretary, she was still baffled by Miss Suckley's constant, dowdy presence at the boss's side and dismissed her as the little mud wren. That was how Daisy wanted it. She told 2 generations of scholars who came to call at Wilderstein, her family's Rhinebeck home, that she really had very little to add to the Roosevelt story, had simply been privileged to be a social friend. When asked whether she had ever kept a diary, she would smile and answer with a question of her own. What makes you think I would keep a diary? That's what she said to me when I visited her one day in 1987. She was 94 then. Her memories of Roosevelt's pre-presidential life on the Hudson were vivid, and perhaps because no one else seemed ever to have asked her much about them, the interview went well. Can you all hear a strange buzzing sound? There, seems to have stopped. It's a hearing aid problem. Sorry. Where was I? The interview went well. She was especially glad, she told me, that I hadn't probed her painful memories of the president's last hours at Warm Springs. Finally, as I was about to leave, she said she had something she felt she had to show me, something she had kept from every other writer. I was thrilled. She rose from her chair and searched through the clutter of the dining room in which we were sitting until she found her black purse. From it, she drew an ancient, dog-eared envelope. I always keep this near me, she said, opening the envelope and carefully smoothing its yellowed contents on the tabletop. It's very important. I held my breath as she began to read aloud. It was a clipping from the National Enquirer. It seemed that an Irish medium had been in touch with FDR. The president reported that he was having a perfectly grand time on the other side. Doesn't that sound just like him, she asked. It did, of course, but I put it down to her advanced years and thought no more about it, grateful for the few scraps of more conventionally recalled history she'd given me. During the time it took me to finish my 2 books on FDR, I had a recurrent and maddening dream. In it, he and I played endless games of cards across his big presidential desk. He was, as you might imagine, a genial, if intimidating, card player. Hardy, voluble, willing to take enormous risks, and serenely certain he would win no matter what cards he was dealt. And from time to time as we played, usually while he told me a long, involved anecdote whose details I could never quite remember in the morning, but which invariably reflected well on himself, he would wink, take a card from his hand, and slip it inside his jacket. I did not take all of Roosevelt's tricks. No one ever will. But I took enough so that when the second book was published, I did stop having that dream. Still, 1,279 pages later, I was little wiser about the issues that had meant the most to me when I started out. I still didn't know whether FDR ever privately admitted being discouraged or ever permitted anyone to understand how he felt about his handicap. And it seemed unlikely now that I would ever get answers. Then, in 1991, I got another phone call. Daisy Suckley had died at Wilderstein in her 100th year. Friends cleaning out her cluttered bedroom had found a battered suitcase beneath her bed. Inside were thousands of pages of diaries, as well as scores of her letters to him and 38 from him to her. She had cheerfully fooled 2 generations of biographers about her importance to the Roosevelt story, but she had also been unable to bring herself to destroy the evidence of the friendship that had meant the world to her. I was privileged to spend another year and a half editing her papers and got a glimpse of a Franklin Roosevelt no one but she had ever seen before. Nothing else I've done professionally has ever been quite so personally satisfying. Their relationship began as a mild flirtation, but grew over time into a friendship that I believe was deeper than any other in Roosevelt's life. She wanted nothing from him other than to be at his side. He loved her too, in his fashion, and trusted her with secrets he confided in no one else. The date of D-Day, for example, and his secret plan to leave the White House once the war was over and become Secretary General of the United Nations. Would that he had done that. He was not always truthful with her or with anyone else, for that matter, but he was more emotionally candid than he was with anyone else. He confessed to her that he was sometimes weary, bored, frustrated. Do you know that you alone have known that I was a bit cast down these past few weeks, FDR told her on one occasion. I couldn't let anyone else know it, but somehow I seem to tell you all those things, and what I don't happen to tell you, you seem to know anyway. More remarkable still, he spoke freely with her about the irritation polio constantly caused him. His inability simply to walk away from an awkward conversation. Having to put on his braces to greet the voters at every whistle stop. The pain he experienced from having to stand and speak too long. I'm sure Daisy Suckley would be quietly pleased that since the publication of her papers, no serious biographer dare fail to consult them. And I confess, from a purely personal point of view, it was good to know that polio sometimes bothered the hell out of Franklin Roosevelt, too. For all his easy charm, the young Roosevelt with whom I spent so much time was in many ways unappealing. Arrogant, self-centered, irresponsible, disloyal to his superiors, unsteady in his views, and unfaithful to his wife. But he was redeemed, at least in part, by his gallant 7-year struggle to regain his feet. My great-grandfather, Ferdinand, had no such redeeming qualities. The best way to begin to understand who he was is to see him in action through the embarrassed reminiscence of one of the many men he gulled. Late one afternoon in April of 1884, an elderly businessman entered the paneled offices of the investment firm of Grant and Ward at number 2 Wall Street and asked to see the junior partner, Ferdinand Ward. There were 3 other partners: ex-President Grant's son, Ulysses S. Grant Jr., James D. Fish, the venerable president of the city's second most important financial institution, the Marine Bank of New York, and General Grant himself, who left day-to-day direction of the firm to Ward and rarely even bothered to come to the office. The visitor was greeted warmly. Ward was just 34 that spring, slender, soft-spoken, with impeccable manners. Possessed of what one Wall Street veteran remembered as extraordinary persuasive powers without appearing to have any selfish object in view, he was widely regarded as one of the most promising young brokers in New York. He and his wife and infant son occupied a richly furnished brownstone at 81 Pierpont Street in Brooklyn Heights, as well as a splendid summer home with gardens and stables filled with fine horses at Stamford, Connecticut. He and James Fish had bought Edwin Booth's theater, too, as well as building lots and rental properties all over the city. Jay Gould himself was said to admire Ward's skills. He was widely known on Wall Street as the young Napoleon of finance. Still, his visitor this morning was indignant. He had left $50,000 with the firm before leaving for Europe 6 months earlier, he reminded the young man, and had heard nothing whatsoever of his investment since. Ward apologized for having been silent for so long. The firm had been very busy, so busy, he said, that he'd fallen shamefully far behind in his bookkeeping. But it would only take a moment to find out how the investment had fared. Ward retired to an inner office, then returned a moment later and handed his visitor a check. His $50,000 had grown to $250,000. The old man was astonished at his good luck. It was too late in the day to deposit his windfall in the bank, so he lay awake all night thinking that if he had just left his money in Ward's adroit hands to grow at the same rate for another 6 months, he would become a millionaire. When Grant and Ward opened the next morning, the investor was waiting in the hallway, hat in hand. He was sorry if he'd seemed abrupt the day before. He said, "Would Mr. Ward be so kind as to overlook his rudeness, tear up the check he'd written, and let the money continue to multiply?" Ferdinand Ward could not have been more gracious. He smiled, took back the check, and personally made a note of its return in his big ledger. "It is marvelous," wrote the Wall Street veteran Henry Clue, to whom the sheepish investor later recounted this story, "how the idea of large profits, when presented to the mind in a plausible light, has the effect of stifling suspicion." There were, in fact, 2 sets of books, the one Ward used when investors came calling, and another hidden in the back of the safe, from which examiners would later learn there had been no profits at all. The secret government contracts in which all the investments had supposedly been made themselves were imaginary. Ward was running a Ponzi scheme before Charles Ponzi was born. A week after the old man's visit, on May 6, 1885, the Marine Bank failed. Its president, James Fish, had ruined it, making frantic loans to cover the firm's mounting losses, and would eventually go to prison. The firm of Grant and Ward went under too. A full-scale Wall Street panic followed. Ward and Fish had swindled General Grant, his family, and hundreds of lesser investors out of tens of millions of dollars. I should add that not a penny reached any of Ferdinand Ward's descendants. Everything he had was seized by his legion of justifiably enraged creditors. I haven't time this evening to catalog all my ancestors' crimes, but here's a partial docket. He was sentenced to 12 years in Sing Sing for passing a bad check and would have spent far more time upstate had 6 far more substantive indictments not been pigeonholed because prosecutors could find no witnesses willing to testify publicly about their own gullibility. He bribed the warden to provide him with a soft job and a special cell, complete with Persian rugs. Within a week of being sprung, he talked a widow's unmarried daughter into handing over her savings, and then swindled 17 citizens of his upstate hometown, each of whom had gone out of his way to welcome him home after prison. He hired 2 thugs to kidnap his 10-year-old son, my grandfather, in order to get his hands on the pittance left the boy by his late mother. The plot failed, and he spent the rest of his life hounding his son for money and cadging a living from relatives and naive strangers, and so far as I can see, never doing more than about a week's honest work in his whole life. I can't recall who first told me about my great-grandfather. It may have been my father, who had met his grandfather just once while still a small child, and remembered him only dimly as an impossibly thin old man with a white mustache rocking on the front porch of a frame house on Staten Island. Perhaps it was my grandfather who first mentioned Ferdinand Ward to me. He had known his father all too well, and his bright blue eyes, even in his 80s, still mirrored fear at the mention of his name. In any case, by the time I was 12 or 13, I knew at least the outlines of my ancestor's life. A few years later, when I was visiting from college, my grandfather turned over to me a dusty cardboard carton filled with brown, brittle papers tied into bundles with dirty twine. They were the crumbling contents of Ferdinand Ward's Sing Sing trunk and had rested unread in the closet safe off my grandfather's study for more than half a century. Scores of letters still in their envelopes, faded photographs, court documents bound with red ribbon, tiny scraps of paper covered on both sides with near microscopic writing, including a dirty joke that had evidently been handed from cell to cell. It seemed like the makings of a book to me, and over the 40 years that followed, when I wasn't engaged on other projects, those papers helped me trace distant relatives with papers of their own, led me through miles of microfilm newspapers, sent me and my wife Diane to Rochester and London, and all the way to South India, where Ferdinand's parents had been missionaries before he was born. I never questioned great-grandpa's guilt. What I wanted to find out was why, given all the awful things he'd undeniably done, he never once admitted any degree of guilt, portrayed himself instead as the innocent victim of others. It was his investors who had been at fault, he always said, because most of them were older and more experienced than he. They should have known better than to trust him with their money. It was an enjoyable pursuit, but maddening. I managed to have a drink with one of his last victims, Mrs. Lawrence Eyre. She received me in the parlor of her Upper East Side apartment, its walls covered with cameo portraits of illustrious forebears. I was suitably intimidated. In 1910, my great-grandfather had done her out of $500, she told me. I squirmed a little, wondering silently what 60 years of compound interest added up to, and what the financial obligations of a great-grandson might be. But I don't mind, she continued, smiling at the memory and relieving my mind. He was so sympathetic, so charming. He could charm the birds from the trees. How I loved to see him come through the door. I also tracked down Mrs. Eyre's first husband, Judge Jasper Yates Brinton, in Cairo, Egypt. He had a distinctly different impression. He was 92 when I first wrote to him. He was the son of Ferdinand's older sister. His father, Dr. John H. Brinton, an eminent Philadelphia physician, had served as General Grant's surgeon during the Civil War, and never got over the humiliation of having his own brother-in-law be the instrument of his old commander's ruin. The judge very kindly sent me packets of his mother's letters, hundreds of them. But memories of the shame my great-grandfather, his Uncle Ferd, had brought upon his family were still fresh, and he remained wary, worried, as he said, that some sensation seeker would reopen his family's old wounds. I finally was permitted an interview with him during one of his annual visits to the United States. He was unfailingly courteous, but virtually silent whenever I brought the conversation back to Ferdinand Ward. I kept at it anyway. His eyes suddenly filled with tears, remembering what he called the tremendous blow the scandal had dealt his family in Philadelphia. It had been so humiliating, he told me, that his father had almost resigned from his clubs. And he volunteered that while he was sorry to have to say it, especially to his great-grandson, Uncle Ferd had always had a slippery air when he came to call in later years and was always asking to be introduced to wealthy friends. I had learned that not long before Ferdinand's death, he had entrusted the judge, then a young lawyer, with a thick sheaf of papers he called his autobiography. It totally exonerated him, my great-grandfather always claimed, and it named the real culprits, prominent men, he said, with fine reputations. He had loudly threatened to publish it whenever he thought he could get one embarrassed relative or another to give him some money to prevent him from doing so. I was sure it contained no actual proof of innocence, but I still wanted to see that manuscript. Where was it now? I finally tentatively asked. The old man's eyes lit up for the first time. He smiled triumphantly and thrust his long, thin fingers at me. I burned it page by page, he said, with these hands. He had clearly waited decades for the pleasure of telling someone that. I was on my own again. In the end, I was pleased to be able to describe in fresh detail the damage my great-grandfather did to the members of his own family, to those who thought they'd been his friends, to the Grant family, and to the hundreds of other innocent people he ruined. It's a lively, if disheartening, tale of life in the Gilded Age. But try as I might, I was never able to discern the causes for his relentlessly criminal behavior, and finally had to fall back on the belief that Ferdinand Ward, like Bernie Madoff in our time, was simply a sociopath, born without a conscience or the ability to empathize with others, able only to imitate emotions genuinely felt by other people, determined to be rich, and capable of doing anything to make it happen. As I said at the outset about writing biographies, sometimes you find answers to the questions with which you began. Sometimes you remain as baffled as you were when you started. But for me, whatever the outcome, the sleuthing makes it all worthwhile. Thank you.